Okay, welcome. So last night you read two documents concerning Hungary as well as Vietnam, and certainly there were some interesting parallels there. What did you pick up from a key similarity between Hungary, or maybe I should start off with a key difference between Hungary and Vietnam with respect to the way that the United States approached this particular conflict?
The United States was more involved in Vietnam and they did nothing in terms of Hungary. They just ignored them completely. They took a depth.
Right. I mean, it is complete opposites, right? Eisenhower is so scared about using this nuclear option, doesn't want to use mass retaliation, does absolutely nothing to support the democratically led coalition trying to get rid of the Soviet Union influence and overthrow communism. Whereas in Vietnam, of course, we know from some of your past knowledge that the United States is going to be heavily involved in Vietnam in one of the more unpopular wars, and it's actually a big turning point culturally and politically, as we'll see in the coming days. And you also, Mr. Trokin went through the screencast last night, and of course this is what's going to set us up for the Vietnam War between the North and the South. And again, that's very similar to what other country? Korea, right, where you're dividing it at a certain parallel, in this case, the 17th. And again, the whole idea that's being espoused is you need to contain it. And eventually, the idea of the domino theory, that if you let one domino fall, all the rest are going to fall. So there's the idea that you need to stomp out communism where and whenever you can. Otherwise, it's going to spread. And it was, of course, considered a major threat to the United States. And then, as you also talked about, with Diem being the local-backed leader, certainly somewhat unpopular concerning religious differences. But as even though he's nothing close to a democratic leader, that's okay because he's not communistic. Again, the idea here is the United States will put in any idiot, any jerk, any dictator, as long as he or she is not communistic. The goal is not democracy, the goal is to prevent communism. There is a big difference there. You'll do anything to prevent communism. So democracy is sort of taking that back burner approach. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that a little bit. And of course, as we said, during the Hungarian uprising, the United States just does absolutely nothing. So a very big difference, as you see there. Okay, so Kennedy, you've all heard fantastic things about him. Interestingly enough, while he is a popular president, he's not really a good president. I mean, he had past experience as a senator as well as a congressman, but if you really evaluate his role as a president, really somewhat inexperienced, takes a few uncalculated risks, which don't work in his favor with respect to Cuba. But nevertheless, he is elected in 1960. He is the first and only Catholic. There was a man named John Kerry, if you remember, he's the Secretary of State for the United States currently right now. He ran for the presidency in 2004, and he was also a Catholic, but he did not win. So Kennedy remains the only Catholic president. Most presidents are actually Protestant. They tend to be Protestant, white, older men. That tends to be the demographic. So Kennedy is going to run on a campaign program known as the New Frontier. I mean, you think about frontier, like a new beginning, a new opening, where he's going to be promising extraordinary funding for things like education, healthcare, and even trying to help with civil rights. The problem is some of his programs are going to be thwarted by Congress. It's sort of in a way, I don't want to say entirely akin to the Obama presidency, but with President Obama, he's had some trouble passing some of his legislation because of Congress being of the opposite political party. To some extent, that's going to happen with Kennedy. But nevertheless, some of the big promises he's going to make: continue fighting the Cold War, beat the Soviets where it mattered. And when we talk about where it mattered, you're not just talking about trying to rid out communistic influences throughout the world, but we're also talking about key things like the space race, putting a man specifically on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which will be fulfilled. But sort of that thought that you could put a man on the moon was just unfathomable. I mean, they tried to put a monkey in a satellite along with a dog, and of course that didn't work out all that well. Another thing that Kennedy's going to espouse is this idea of flexible response, Whereas under the Eisenhower administration, it was sort of like we're heavily focused and relying on nuclear weapons and massive retaliation. With JFK, he's going to sort of use a variety of different tools, from non-nuclear arms and ammunition, but again, not completely discounting nuclear arms, but again, just having a wide array of tools. So you're not just focused on using nuclear weapons, using other means. And of course, as we looked at in his speech, he also espouses diplomacy heavily. Now, if you look at Kennedy, he actually goes up against Richard Nixon, who of course will become a president later on. But in the popular vote, he only beats him by about 100,000 votes, so it is a relatively close election, although if you look at the Electoral College, not as close as the popular vote is. But certainly, one of the more famous debates that they have is Kennedy versus Nixon. And if you watched Kennedy and Nixon, you thought Kennedy won, because Nixon is like, getting pressed on certain issues, and he starts sweating. He wasn't really he was an okay debater, but he starts sweating. Like, if you have that visual appearance is everything on television. So when they polled people after the debate, the people who watched it on television thought Kennedy won. The people on the radio, were listening to the radio, thought Nixon had won. But nevertheless, Kennedy prevails. So one of the biggest blunders of Kennedy's presidency deals with the Cuban Revolution. Now, prior to this point, you had something similar to the Marshall Plan, which was known as the Alliance for Progress, the idea that you're going to be funding Latin American countries to sort of help prop them up. It really doesn't do much, as there's some corruption, money goes into the hands of the elite, and of course, if you're just an average peasant, your land has been taken, you can barely make a living, communism is going to suck you in. The idea of communal property, people being equal, you don't have this idea of elites. That's why communism is such a draw, especially to people in poverty. So the Alliance for Progress does very, very little in that sense. In Cuba at this point, you have a corrupt dictatorship that's actually working in conjunction with the American mafia, who's taking kickbacks and bribing the government. And of course, by no means is Batista in particular benefiting the people. So what do the people want? Fidel Castro, the man who's promising to redistribute land, nationalize resources, all for the people's benefit. That's why communism is such a draw. And of course, if you have any questions, even though we're live, Emily can just calm down and we can ask as many questions. So don't feel weird if you have any questions on this. So Fidel Castro will lead the July movement, takes over Cuba quite successfully, becomes very popular in 1959. And he will begin to start talks with the USSR, which he will be receiving financial support. Of course, this is going to worry the heck out of Kennedy. So you had exiles known as Cuban emigres, like immigrants who had left Cuba, who had been exiled to Nicaragua. What they come up with is a plan that was originally crafted by Eisenhower. And his plan was to invade through the Bay of Pigs. It was the actual bay where they would be trying to get rid of Castro. The problem is Castro is very popular. And interestingly enough, Castro is sort of a guy throughout history who just won't die. Like, the CIA tried to kill him a couple of times. They've had assassination attempts, but he just doesn't die. He's still alive. He's like very feeble. Has anyone ever seen him give a speech, and then after he's done talking, he trips and falls flat on his face? I'll have to show you that. It's a great video. But nevertheless, Castro is still alive, although I think his brother Raul is in power now, but still a dictatorship. So JFK, as he espouses this program in this plan, which he's going to use ex-Cubans to invade the Bay of Pigs and try to overthrow Castro, it is a complete and utter failure. They don't take into account the geography or the land or even the will of the people to sort of continue communism. As a result, it fails, and when the ex-Cubans need air support, Kennedy just scraps the entire plan and says, I don't want to invade, I don't want to do anything to exacerbate this problem. It is the biggest blunder under Kennedy's under his administration. It almost looks like he's too naive, too inexperienced, that this young guy doesn't know what he's doing, and this really takes a toll on his polls. So as a result, Castro is going to declare Cuba a communist country. Here you can see where the Bay of Pigs is located, where they try to invade, but again, it falls flat on its face. So as a result of this effort, Castro has a little bit more leverage and actually receives even more support from the USSR, in particular from Khrushchev. And Khrushchev looks at Cuba with like glowing eyes, because Cuba is so darn close to Florida. At some point, you are only about 90 miles away, which is not that far. And what really begins to worry Americans, especially when U-2 planes, who are reconnaissance planes, are able to look at satellite images that show that nuclear weapons and possible missiles are being delivered in an underground site in Cuba. So JFK begins to call them out and actually sets up a blockade around Cuba to prevent any more resources that are going to be provided to Cuba. And he originally tells Khrushchev to take out the missiles. He refuses, but then later acquiesces. But this whole idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, you are not that far. It could easily, in this picture you see, hit close to Washington and had as far-reaching effects and distances as Canada. So that was really a fear. I mean, you're not that far from Cuba, and people were very much afraid that this was going to turn into some type of catastrophe. Ultimately, what happens is Khrushchev will agree to take away the missiles, and then Kennedy secretly agrees to remove his missiles from Turkey, which, of course, if you know where Turkey is not all that far away from the USSR. So diplomacy there. So let's get back to Berlin. We are jumping around a little bit. Berlin is still divided into the four powers. You have your Eastern Bloc, you have your Western Bloc. And at this point, there is no Berlin Wall. It's relatively free movement. You know, if you didn't like the Eastern Bloc, you would go to the Western Bloc or vice versa. But what the United States is going to essentially do to attract the Eastern Berliners, because again, this is more of an ideological war than anything, is they're going to open up an American-made university, Freie Universität, if you will. And this is going to appeal heavily to the Eastern Berliners. What is the Soviet Union offering? Not that. So what this does is it begins to attract many, many Eastern Germans who are going to Western Berlin, and it began a phenomenon known as a brain drain, where you take the brightest people into your country. You take immigration, for example, in the United States today. The United States loves taking the smartest people from India or China. Why? It's not a brain drain for us, it's a brain gain. Exactly. You have companies today, for example, like Intel, that one, right? That company was started by immigrants, and now today employs tens of thousands of people with, you know, high-paying jobs out in California. So that's the idea of having a good brain gain. Brain drain for Eastern Berlin. Now, what do you think is going to happen as a result of this influx of Eastern Berliners into the western part? What do you think Khrushchev's next idea or next plan is going to be? Any idea? A wall, exactly. This will begin the construction of the wall, indeed. And we'll certainly set you up for that on Monday's notes/screencast. All right, any questions, issues, concerns? Okay.